Stop everything you're doing right now, because that motorcycle you sold in 2005 for $3,000. It just sold at auction last month for $150,000. I'm not talking about some rare prototype or factory racer. I'm talking about regular production motorcycles that our generation rode, crashed, rebuilt, and, sadly, sold. How many of you watching right now have that one motorcycle story? The bike you let go because you needed the money, or your wife said it had to go, or you just thought it's just an old bike? Well, today, I'm about to show you the 10 motorcycles that went from garage sale finds to millionaire maker mistakes. And I guarantee at least one of these is going to make you sick to your stomach. But before we dive into this painful journey down memory lane, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. Because if you're part of this generation, you need to know which bikes are about to explode in value next. And here's what I want you to do. When you see a bike you used to own, drop it in the comments with what you sold it for. Let's create the ultimate haul of regret together. Let's start with number 10, and this one's going to hurt. Honda CB 754, the Honda CB 750, the bike that changed everything. Back in the day, it was just reliable transportation. Every college kid had one. They were everywhere. You could pick up a decent runner for $800 in the classifieds. Hell, I remember seeing them in the newspaper for $500 with the caption, "Runs good, needs nothing." We treated them like appliances. Commuter bikes, winter beaters, the kind of machine you'd lend to your buddy without thinking twice. Nobody was babying these things or storing them in climate-controlled garages. Original price in 1969, $1,495. What they're selling for now? Clean examples are hitting $25,000 to $40,000. A pristine 1969 model with original paint and 8,000 miles just sold at Macomb for $52,000. $52,000. For a bike that used to be more common than dirt. But here's the kicker. Most of us didn't think twice about modifying them, chopping them, or using them as daily riders until they died. We cut the fenders, threw on drag bars, and turned them into cafe racers. Every modification we thought made them cooler actually destroyed their future value. The bone stock, unmolested, CB 750S. They're rarer than hen's teeth now. I talked to a collector last month who's been hunting for an original 1969 CB 750 with matching numbers and original exhaust for 3 years. 3 years. He's got $60,000 cash ready to go, and he still can't find one. Yamaha RD350 number 9 will make every two-stroke lover weep. The Yamaha RD350, the student bike, the beginner's sport bike. The bike your dad bought you for graduation because it was cheap and wouldn't kill you, or so he thought. We thought of it as disposable, didn't we? A stepping stone to something bigger, something better, something four-stroke. These little screamers were everywhere in the mid-70s. Motorcycle dealerships couldn't keep them in stock. They were selling them to kids, commuters, anyone who wanted something fast, but couldn't afford a real superbike. At $1,200 new, they were the affordable thrill ride. But here's what we didn't realize. That two-stroke engine was pure magic. 39 horsepower out of 347. CC doesn't sound like much today, but in 1974, that little Yamaha would dust most cars on the street. The power-to-weight ratio was insane. And that sound, that angry wasp scream when you wound it up to 8,000 revolutions per minute. Nothing else sounded like it. Today, try $15,000 to $25,000 for a good one. And if you find an unrestored Survivor with original paint and low miles, forget about it. I saw a 1974 RD350 with 4,200 original miles sell at auction for $31,000. $31,000 for a bike that most people bought as cheap transportation. I talked to a guy last month who sold his 74 RD350 in 1992 for $800 because it needed new rings and he was tired of mixing oil. That bike, if he'd kept it and restored it properly, would be worth $20,000 today. He could have bought a decent used car with what that bike is worth now. The tragedy is that most R.350S lived hard lives. They were raced, crashed, stunted, and rode until they exploded. Finding one that hasn't been molested or rebuilt with aftermarket parts is like finding buried treasure. Number 8 is the bike they called the Widowmaker. The Kawasaki H2 750. The triple that tried to kill its riders on a daily basis. Back then, it was just the crazy fast bike that your insurance company refused to cover, and your mother prayed you'd never buy. It had a reputation that preceded it into every dealership and bike show. This wasn't a bike for beginners. This was 74 horsepower of pure, unfiltered aggression wrapped in a frame that seemed designed by someone who'd never heard of the concept of handling. The front end would lift in 3 gears. The handling was described as interesting by motorcycle magazines. And the brakes, well, let's just say they were more of a suggestion than a command. They sold for around $1,400 new in 1972. Now, $30,000 to $50,000 for pristine examples. And that's if you can find one that hasn't been crashed, chopped, or turned into spare parts. Most H2s lived fast and died young, just like their riders. But here's what made the H2 special. It was the last of the truly dangerous motorcycles. Before lawyers and liability lawsuits neutered everything, Kawasaki built a bike that was pure, undiluted performance. No electronic aids, no safety features, no forgiveness. Just you. 500 pounds of steel, and enough power to put you in orbit. I know a collector who's been hunting for an original 1972 H2 with the factory paint scheme for 5 years. He's found plenty of restored ones, plenty of modified ones, but finding one that survived 50 years without being altered is nearly impossible. When one does surface, the bidding war gets vicious. The irony is that the very things that made the H2 dangerous back then, the explosive power delivery, the sketchy handling, the mechanical simplicity, are exactly what collectors want today. They want to experience what motorcycling was like when it was still dangerous, when the bikes were built to go fast first and worry about everything else second. Now we're getting into the territory where the regret gets real. The BMW R90S, the bike that most of us thought was just that weird German thing. While we were all obsessing over Japanese speed machines and British classics, BMW was quietly building what would become one of the most beautiful motorcycles ever made. See, in 1973, BMW wasn't cool. They were the bike your engineering professor rode to work. They were reliable, sure, but they were also expensive, weird, and completely different from everything else on the market. The opposed twin engines stuck out like mechanical elbows. The shaft drive seemed overly complicated. And the styling was, well, it was German. The R90S was BMW's attempt to build a superbike, and most Americans just didn't get it. While Kawasaki was building the H2 and Honda was perfecting the CB750, BMW created this elegant, sophisticated machine that looked like it belonged in an art museum rather than a drag race. Original price? About $2,900 in 1973. That was serious money back then. You could buy a new Volkswagen Beetle for less. Most people looked at that price tag and went straight to the Honda dealer instead. Current value, $45,000 to $70,000 for excellent examples. A concours-winning R90S with original paint and documentation sold at Bonham's last year for $89,000. $89,000 for a bike that most people couldn't be bothered to understand when it was new. I know a dealer who bought 3 R90S motorcycles in the early 2000s for $8,000 each. He thought he was overpaying at the time. His friends told him he was crazy for buying those old German bikes when he could get Japanese classics for half the price. He still has them. Do the math on what they're worth today. The thing about the R90S is that it was ahead of its time in every way. The build quality, the attention to detail, the engineering sophistication. It was what motorcycles would eventually become. But in 1973, most riders weren't ready for that level of refinement. Number 6 is the Italian heartbreaker, the Ducati 750 SS. Most Americans didn't get Ducati back then. They were quirky Italian bikes with weird maintenance schedules, impossible to find parts, and a reputation for being temperamental prima donnas that spent more time in the shop than on the road. When the 750 SS showed up in 1974, it was like nothing else on the American market. That yellow frame, the desmodromic engine, the distinctive L-twin sound, it was pure Italian exotica. But exotic meant expensive, and expensive meant most people couldn't afford to buy one, let alone maintain one. Ducati wasn't a household name like Honda or Yamaha. They were that weird Italian brand that made racing bikes for Europeans. Finding parts meant calling obscure importers or waiting months for shipments from Bologna. Finding a mechanic who understood desmodromic valves was like finding a unicorn. Original price was around $3,200 in 1974. Serious money when you could buy a Honda CB 750 for half that. Most people looked at the Ducati, heard the stories about maintenance nightmares, and walked away. The few who bought them either fell madly in love or sold them quickly when the first major service bill arrived. Today, $60,000 to $100,000 for good examples. A pristine 1974 750 SS green frame model sold at Bonham's for $137,000. $137,000. More than most people's houses. But here's what makes this heartbreaking. Every 750 SS that survived is a testament to someone's dedication. These weren't bikes you could ignore. They demanded attention, proper maintenance, and understanding. The ones that made it to 2025 were loved, pampered, and preserved by people who understood what they had. I met an owner last year who bought his 750 SS new in 1975. He was a young engineer who fell in love with the sound and the engineering. His friends called him crazy for buying an Italian bike when Japanese motorcycles were so much more reliable. 50 years later, his bike is worth more than his first house. Number 5 represents the end of an era. The Norton Commando 750, the last great British motorcycle before the empire crumbled. By 1970, when the Commando was introduced, British motorcycles already had a reputation for being unreliable, oil-leaking relics that broke down more often than they ran. But the Commando was different. Norton's engineers had created something special. An engine that made real power, wrapped in a frame that actually handled, with styling that looked like it came from the future instead of the past. The isolastic mounting system was revolutionary, virtually eliminating the vibration that made other British twins into paint shaker torture devices. The problem was timing. By the time Norton got their act together, Japanese motorcycles had already conquered the American market. Honda, Yamaha, Kawasaki, and Suzuki were building bikes that started every time, didn't leak oil, and came with warranties that meant something. Why would anyone buy a British bike when you could get a Honda? They sold for about $1,800 new in 1970. That was competitive with the Japanese bikes, but the reputation of British motorcycles was already shot. Dealers were going out of business, parts were becoming scarce, and everyone knew that British bikes were unreliable. Now, $25,000 to $45,000, with the best examples pushing $60,000. But here's what makes this one special. Every Commando that survived represents a piece of motorcycle history that almost died forever. These weren't just motorcycles. They were the last gasps of an entire industry. When Norton went bankrupt in 1977, it wasn't just a company failing. It was the end of Britain as a motorcycle manufacturing power. The Commando was the last time a British manufacturer would build a world-class motorcycle that could compete with the best from anywhere. I know collectors who specifically hunt for Commandos because they represent something that can never be recreated. You can build retro bikes that look like classics, but you can't rebuild an entire industrial heritage. Every Commando that survived carries the DNA of decades of British engineering innovation. The irony is that the problems that killed Norton, inconsistent quality, poor dealer network, financial instability, are exactly what makes surviving Commandos so valuable today. They're rare because the company that built them died, and you can't get any more rare than extinct. Now we enter the realm where grown men cry. Harley-Davidson XLCR, Cafe Racer, the Harley that Harley riders hated. The XLCR Cafe Racer. Willie G. Davidson's attempt to drag Harley-Davidson kicking and screaming into the modern era. In 1977, while traditional Harley buyers wanted bigger, louder, more chrome-laden touring machines, Willie G. looked at what was happening in Europe and said, "We need to build a cafe racer." The problem was that nobody asked Harley riders if they wanted a cafe racer. They walked into dealerships expecting to see electric glides and super glides, and instead, they found this black, minimalist, European-inspired machine that looked like nothing Harley had ever built before. Traditional Harley guys took one look at the XLCR and walked away. It was too weird, too different, too un-Harley. Where was the chrome? Where were the touring accessories? Why did it look so much like those foreign bikes? Only 3,200 were made in 2 years because Harley simply couldn't sell them. Original price? $3,200 in 1977. Dealers were practically giving them away by 1979, offering huge discounts just to move them off the floor. Most sat in showrooms for months before being sold to curious buyers who wanted something different from Harley. What they're worth now? $30,000 to $50,000 for good examples. Pristine, unrestored examples have hit $65,000 at major auctions. The bike that real Harley guys rejected is now worth more than most of their precious touring machines. The irony is delicious. The XLCR represented everything that Harley would eventually become. Performance-oriented, internationally competitive, design-focused. Willie G was 20 years ahead of his customer base, building the bike that Harley should have been making all along. I know a Harley dealer who still talks about the XLCR he had sitting on his showroom floor for 18 months in 1978. He offered it at cost, threw in free accessories, even offered financing deals that bordered on charity. Finally sold it to a young guy for $2,400, just to make room for bikes people actually wanted. That bike would be worth $50,000 today. Number 3 is pure Italian aristocracy. The MV Agusta 750 S America. Only 701 were ever made. Ever. When they were new, most people couldn't even pronounce the name correctly, let alone afford one, or find a dealer who could service it. MV Agusta wasn't just rare, it was practically mythical. This was the company that dominated Grand Prix racing throughout the 1960s and early 70s. When they decided to build a street bike for the American market, it wasn't going to be some mass-produced commuter machine. This was going to be a hand-built masterpiece that happened to be street legal. The 750 S America was everything that made Italian motorcycles legendary and terrifying at the same time. It was beautiful beyond description, with that distinctive red and silver paint scheme and sculptural bodywork that looked like rolling art. The engine was a jewel-like 4-cylinder that revved to 11,000 revolutions per minute and made sounds that would make grown men weep. But it was also hilariously impractical. The riding position was torture for anything longer than a sprint to the coffee shop. The maintenance schedule required the dedication of a monk and the budget of a millionaire. Finding parts meant knowing someone who knew someone who had connections in Italy. Original price was around $4,000 in 1975. Absolutely insane money when a Honda CB 750 cost half that. Most people looked at the price tag, looked at the lack of dealer network, looked at the reputation for complexity, and bought something Japanese instead. Current value, $150,000 to $250,000 for good examples. A pristine, numbers-matching 750 S America sold at RM Sotheby's for $302,000. $302,000. More than most people make in 5 years for a motorcycle. But here's what you have to understand about the 750 S America. It wasn't just a motorcycle. It was a piece of racing history that you could legally ride on the street. Every one that was built carried the DNA of the machines that won world championships. When you bought one, you weren't just buying transportation. You were buying a connection to the golden age of Grand Prix racing. The 701 that were built have scattered to the winds. Some went to collectors who understood what they had. Others went to riders who bought them to ride and eventually sold them when the maintenance became too much. A few were crashed, a few were stolen, and some just disappeared into garages where they've been sitting for decades. Finding one today is like archaeological work. You have to trace ownership histories, verify serial numbers, and prove authenticity. The market is so hot that even project bikes, non-running examples that need complete restoration, are selling for six figures. Number 2 is the Italian beast that ate highways. The Laverda Jota 1000, the fastest production motorcycle in the world when it was released in 1976. 180 miles per hour in an era when most cars couldn't break 100. This wasn't just fast. This was weapons-grade velocity, wrapped in Italian style and engineering. Laverda built the Jota for one reason: to prove that Italian motorcycles could be the ultimate performance machines. While other manufacturers were focusing on reliability and practicality, Laverda said, let's build something that will scare the hell out of anyone brave enough to ride it. The Jota wasn't for beginners or casual riders. This was 90 horsepower of pure aggression in an era when 60 horsepower was considered a lot. The engine was a triple that sounded like controlled explosions. The handling was razor sharp but unforgiving, and the brakes required the leg strength of a linebacker to stop from triple-digit speeds. Most people couldn't handle that kind of power. This was before ABS, before traction control, before any of the electronic safety nets that modern riders take for granted. When you twisted the throttle on a Jota, you better be ready for what happened next, because there was no going back. They cost about $4,200 new. Serious money that put them in competition with cars rather than other motorcycles. Most people looked at the price, heard the stories about the Jota's aggressive nature, and decided they valued their lives more than ultimate performance. Today, $40,000 to $80,000, with the best examples pushing six figures. But here's the tragedy. Most Jotas were crashed, stunted, or raced to death. The survivors are worth their weight in gold because finding one that hasn't been destroyed by its own performance is nearly impossible. I talked to a motorcycle journalist who rode a new Jota in 1978 for a magazine comparison test. He said it was the most terrifying and exhilarating experience of his life. The bike was so fast that it made everything else feel like a moped, but it was also so demanding that he was exhausted after 20 minutes of riding. Most people bought them for the bragging rights and then discovered they couldn't actually handle owning one. And now, number 1. The motorcycle that makes collectors weep. The Honda RC30. The homologation special that Honda built to go racing. When it debuted in 1988 with a $15,000 price tag, most people thought Honda had lost their minds. $15,000 for a Honda? You could buy a decent used car for that money. But the RC30 wasn't just a Honda. It was Honda's declaration of war on every other motorcycle manufacturer in the world. This was their no compromise. Cost is no object attempt to build the ultimate superbike. Every component was designed and built to racing specifications, then barely detuned enough to be street legal. The RC30 was everything that made 1980s superbikes legendary. The V4 engine that screamed to 12,000 RPM and made power that seemed impossible from 748 cubic centimeters. The chassis that was so sophisticated it made everything else look primitive. The single-sided swing arm that was pure eye candy and functional perfection at the same time. Honda only built 3,000 RC30 worldwide because they only needed to build enough to satisfy racing homologation requirements. This wasn't about making money. This was about winning races and proving technological superiority. Every RC30 that left the factory was essentially a street-legal race bike with lights and mirrors. Today, clean RC30s are selling for $60,000 to $100,000. Low-mileage examples have broken $150,000. A pristine, unregistered RC30 with 12 miles on the odometer sold at auction last year for $201,000. $201,000 for a motorcycle that cost $15,000 when it was new. But here's what makes this the ultimate regret machine. Honda made 3,000 of them. Where are they? Most are crashed, tracked to death, or sitting in pieces in someone's garage because the owner tried to improve them with aftermarket modifications. The RC30 represented the absolute peak of 1980s motorcycle engineering. Everything Honda had learned from decades of racing went into that bike. The attention to detail was obsessive. Even the smallest components were machined to tolerances that most manufacturers reserved for their factory race bikes. Finding an unmolested RC30 today is like finding a unicorn. The temptation to modify them was irresistible. Owners wanted to make them faster, louder, more personalized. But every modification destroyed their collectability and historical significance. The RC30 isn't just a motorcycle. It's a time machine to when Honda decided to show the world exactly what they were capable of building when money and practicality weren't considerations. It's proof that sometimes, just sometimes, manufacturers create something so perfect that it becomes immortal. So what did we learn here today? That time is the ultimate multiplier. That the motorcycles we took for granted, they weren't just transportation. They were investments we didn't know we were making. Every bike on this list has a story. Stories of riders who understood what they had and kept them forever. Stories of riders who sold them for rent money or because their spouse demanded it. Stories of bikes that were crashed, stolen, or simply abandoned in barns and garages across the country. But here's the thing. This story isn't over. Right now, sitting in dealerships and Craigslist ads are the future classics of tomorrow. The bikes that our kids will watch videos about in 2050, wondering how we could have been so blind. What motorcycles are sitting in showrooms right now that nobody's paying attention to? What current models are going to be the next RC30, the next 750 SS, the next bike that goes from commonplace to priceless? Think about it. Every bike on this list was once just another motorcycle sitting on a dealer's floor. Someone walked past them thinking, I'll get one later when I have more money. Or, I'll wait for the next model year. Or, I don't need something that expensive. And now, those same bikes are worth more than houses. So tell me in the comments, which bike on this list did you own? What did you sell it for? And more importantly, which current motorcycle do you think is going to be the next legendary classic? Because somewhere out there, someone is about to sell their future fortune for rent money. Someone's looking at their garage and thinking that old bike is just taking up space. Someone's spouse is saying, you never ride that thing anyway. Don't let it be you. Hit that subscribe button, ring the notification bell, and I'll see you in the next episode of the Motorcycle Vault, where two wheels aren't just transportation, they're treasure.